going. That little boy that you saw in the previous slide is one of our First Nations students, or what we would call Indigenous students in Canada. We have about 5% of our Canadian students are Indigenous. In some of our provinces, we have as many as 20-25%. This boy is walking home from his first day of school in kindergarten, and unless things change, that child will only have about a 30% chance of finishing secondary school, of graduating from high school. The graduation rate for our Indigenous students is only about 30%, whereas for non-Indigenous students, it's about 85%. Next slide, please. Most countries have evaluation systems that involve testing students at different ages during the primary and secondary schooling. And Ecuador is quickly becoming no exception due to the great work of Unival. Many of the countries also participate in large-scale assessment programs, such as PISA, this program of international student assessment. Next one, please. This is about as technical as it's going to get, folks, so don't get frightened away by the graph. This is a graph showing the percentage of youth at age 15, this is based on the PISA study, who have literacy skills below level 3. Now PISA has 6 levels of literacy skills, going from low being level 1, next one being level 2, all the way up to level 6. In the assessment of literacy skills, they look at how well children can identify pieces of information, being able to draw them together, make inferences about them. So it's identify and interpret and infer. And when we look at reading skills with PISA, and we graph it out by the GDP of a country, you get this kind of a curvilinear graph. And you can see that it levels off at about 30%. And that's what we have in Canada. We have about 30% of our children who do not learn to read well by the end of grade 3. And reading is so fundamental to schooling because it opens up so many worlds for children that it's one of the crucial things. Now when you look at some of the lower GDP countries, and you could put Colombia, Peru, Brazil into those categories, you have a lot more children who are vulnerable. That is, vulnerable in the sense that they do not learn to read well, and that usually starts very early. They typically don't learn to read well by the end of grade 2 or grade 3. We don't know yet where Ecuador will fit on this graph, where the dot will lie, but we will soon, within the next year or two. But if it's like some of the other countries, probably you're going to have about 50 or 60% of your population of students who do not learn to read well during the first 2 years of schooling, and then that carries right on through to age 15 and beyond. One of the assumptions of these evaluations, like PISA, is that students' test scores are mainly the result of the efforts of teachers and principals. Not to say that you don't have an important role, but students' results in a test like PISA is a cumulative result of all the life experiences that happened right from birth, or we can even say right from conception. Consequently, if you just have this model of here's the results at age 15, or here's your grade 4 test results, your grade 8 test results, and you say, well, that's all about the teachers or the principals, you're missing a huge part of the story, because the child's scores is that cumulative result of everything that's happened. As a result, test scores are often used inappropriately to develop educational policy, and in many cases to hold teachers accountable. So we set out this model of educational prosperity. When I started getting involved in this most recent study of PISA, I met with the Minister of Education in Guatemala and talked about why they were going to engage in PISA. And she said that they really hoped to find the crucial things that they could do differently, especially for high school students. It was sort of like they were in search of the magic bullet. And I was on my way to Paraguay, where I was going to meet with another minister, and I started jotting down notes on the plane and said, you know, we really need a really comprehensive model, because you're not going to find the magic bullet with PISA and say, oh, gee, if we just improved our teacher-student relations, or we just taught teachers how to control kids better, we'd have better PISA results. It doesn't work that way. Oh, sorry, I need the next slide. Can we go? Sorry, something's happened with the slides. Sorry. Try the next one. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. I set out a model that has some key prosperity outcomes, the things that we want to look at each of 6 stages of development as children make their way from birth through to graduation, through high school graduation. So we have a set of metrics at each stage of development, and we also have what I call the foundations for success, the things that are key drivers of those outcomes at each stage of development. The model talks about 4 ways that success accumulates over the lifespan. Next slide, please. This is a slide I've been using for several years, and I think it kind of underlies the prosperity model. So the first thing is having a good, healthy prenatal experience. We know from our longitudinal data studies, there's been 7 or 8 big ones across the world, that the development of a child in terms of their long-term outcomes begins right at conception. So you need healthy pregnancies. We know many of the risk factors that are prenatal, things like not having children being exposed to toxins during the prenatal period. We also know various perinatal outcomes that affect long-term development. Those lead to good outcomes during the early years. Things like awareness of self and environment, cognitive skills, language and communication skills, physical development, and social skills and approaches to learning. Those 5 outcomes are very well accepted now. They're part of the UNICEF framework. They're part of, there's a paper called Getting Ready, which it's developed by 17 states in the US that sets out those as the most important foundation, as the most important outcomes at that stage. Then you go from that age 4, age 5, into that learning to read period. Now, yes, we want children to become proficient in mathematics skills and science skills and everything else, but those skills become blocked by age 8 or 9 if children do not learn to read well during those first 3 years of schooling. I'm going to be talking about something called the simple view of reading, which really says that there's 2 fundamental processes for learning to read: the coding of learning to decode words, or we say coding skills, and the development of language skills. So by age 8 or 9, in Canada, as I've said, we have about 30% of our children did not learn to read well. And across Latin America, you'd say 60 or 70% do not learn to read well by the end of age 3, by the end of grade 3. If you can imagine, then, what are the prospects for those children moving forward? First of all, academic achievement becomes a problem. We use the expression going from learning to read to reading to learn, because after grade 3, the emphasis changes. Teachers teach stuff now. They teach social studies and science and health. There's no longer an emphasis on teaching children how to read. So, of course, academic achievement is really strongly affected by whether they learn to read well. Studies in the US and Canada suggest that children who do not learn to read well by the end of grade 3, over 90% of them are struggling readers all the way through school. Imagine the psychological toll if you do not learn to read well by age 8 or 9, And every year that you go to school, into grade 4, to grade 5, to grade 6, and you see your classmates moving further and further ahead, and you're understanding less and less of what's going on in the school. So we know that those children who do not learn to read well, their health and well-being is compromised. Not only their mental health, their emotional well-being, but also their physical health. And those things tend to go hand in hand because, well, just in general, emotional health, of course, is related to physical health. But especially during adolescence, kids who have not learned to read well tend to engage in a lot of risky behaviors, alcohol use, drug use, early sexuality, and so on. The third part of that is engagement. And this may be part of where Dr. Watts and I might be in the same worlds, is having children deeply engaged in what they're learning. And we talk about social engagement, which is really about interacting with students in a social way as part of their learning. We talk about institutional engagement, meaning the formal rules of schooling, but we talk mostly about intellectual engagement, students who are deeply engaged in what they're learning. So those three big factors are what lead to school completion, and those are what the factors that are critical for that First Nations boy that I showed you earlier. I'm not going to get into the, next slide please. I keep thinking when I push my button that changes automatically. I won't get into the details of the model, and we'll be giving the PDF to your colleagues here a little later, but I'll be talking about each of those steps. But I just wanted to show you, across the top, you have the prosperity outcomes. And so at birth, you want to have a healthy pregnancy, healthy delivery. As you move into the next stage, language development, cognitive development, physical development, and so on. By the time you get up to age 15, you're looking at things like academic achievement, educational attainment, health and well-being, and engagement. Now, people could argue, say, well, these are not our outcomes, and the model is flexible in that sense because it has to be adapted to its environment. In the last box, for example, we have this notion of ethical citizen, leadership skills, and so on. In some countries, they want students to have a second language, for example. That might be one of your prosperity outcomes. Then we look at the drivers of those outcomes at each stage of development. And so, for example, at age 15, we've got schools having an inclusive context, quality instruction, learning time, and good material resources. And at the same time, you want positive parenting skills, positive intrafamily relations, and family involvement. So here's the idea that success along this life course pathway accumulates in 4 ways: through biological embedding, through the foundations for success, through cumulative effects, and through selection. So I'm going to talk about each of these. And as I'm talking about these, I'm going to talk about some of the programs I'm involved with in our research in Canada, but also some of it worldwide. So here's the, next slide please. Next slide. So here's the basic idea where you've got the prosperity outcomes are those purple circles along the top at the 6 stages of development. And along the pathway, at each stage of development, you've got those green boxes with the green arrows driving the outcomes as you go along. Those are the effects of the foundations for success. During the first few years of schooling, you've got what we call biological embedding, which I'll explain in more detail later. But there's some things that happen during those first 2 years of life that are really quite pernicious in a way. They can be permanent and long-lasting. It doesn't mean the child is doomed forevermore, but it really limits the range of skills that they're likely to develop. And then you've got the purple arrows. Those are the cumulative effects. And then finally you've got selection effects, where kids get selected into different kinds of programs during their life course. Next slide, please. So starting at birth, for example, you have healthy pregnancy, healthy delivery. The foundations for success would include good nutrition for mothers, no exposure to toxins, mother's physical health, mother's emotional health. When I was developing this, I talked to the vice president of our university, and he said, I'm very interested, because he had 4 graduate students in some rural areas of Guatemala, and they had a protocol looking at healthy pregnancies of mothers in rural areas. And they had 4 kind of big issues, health issues that mothers might experience during pregnancy. And in their protocol, they said you only had about 4% of the mothers didn't have any of these problems. Most of them had, 2 or 3 of the various health problems during pregnancy. So next slide, please. Biological embedding. We had a group in Canada, about 15 of us or so, some neuroscientists, some educators, some health scientists, and so on. And we were looking at, first of all, how socioeconomic gradients, that is, how outcomes are related to socioeconomic factors, how those get embedded into a society, and then that moved on to looking at how does that get it under the skin during the early period of life. So we say differential social experiences get under the skin in early life, and through their effects on developing neurobiological pathways affect later trajectories in human health, learning, and behavior. So what we mean by differential learning social experiences is that when we look at this notion of gradients, this relationship between outcomes and socioeconomic status, there's also gradients in the processes that lead to those things. So in Canada, for example, if you look at breastfeeding, which we know to be a protective factor for later diseases, higher social class mothers are more likely to breastfeed their child than lower social class mothers in lower social class families. Smoking works the other way. Mothers who are in higher socioeconomic families are less likely to be smokers than mothers from poorer families. The notion of under the skin is that the work defining neurobiological development and its effects on health, learning, and behavior. And so we know that brain development from conception to age 1 is rapid and extensive, much so, more so than we believed, say, 10 years ago. And it's heavily influenced by the infant's environment. So some of the work that's been going on at Tom Boyce at Stanford, for example, shows that there are actually chemical signatures that get attached to genes that lend the child, after the child is born, more prone to disease and cognitive problems and so on later on in life. I'll give you another example of a latent effect. If any of us eat too much right now, more than we should, we don't get any more fat cells. We just make the fat cells that we have bigger. But there are 3 times in life when you actually get more fat cells. One of those periods is during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. Another is during that first year of life. And then there's also a period during adolescence when youth will get more fat cells. And you can have more fat cells, have a lot of fat cells, and you may not be overweight or obese, but later on it becomes much more difficult to maintain a healthy body weight because you've got too many fat cells. Okay? So that's an example of a latent effect. And there's a lot of latent effects that happen when mothers don't have a healthy pregnancy. So then, next slide. Keep going. Sorry. So then we can get up to age 2. That period of biological embedding, it really continues up to about age 5, but that period from birth to age 2 is very important. Why? Because there are critical periods for brain development that happen. If any of you had to have your eye patched, maybe some problem with your eye, and you had your eye patched for 3 or 4 months, and you take that patch off, you'll regain sight in that eye right away. But a baby during those first 2 years of life, if they have their eye patched, the synapses are not formed, and as a result, they get pruned away such that that part of the brain doesn't get developed And you can actually see that with MRIs and so on. Next slide, please. So we start then with billions of neurons, and during that course of development, they form connections called synapses, and those get pruned away if there isn't adequate stimulation. The neurobiologists call that the wiring or the sculpting of the brain. Next slide, please. And here's a slide from some work by the National Council on Child Development that shows some of those critical periods. And later I'm going to show you a fun slide from some work done at the University of Chicago. Next slide, please. So that's the biological embedding story. When I told that to the minister in Guatemala, she says, "Oh, that's very pessimistic." She says, "Don't you believe in resilience? Sounds like it's permanent." Well, I can't remember the lead football player in Guatemala right now, but I said, when that little sperm hits that egg, you might have had a Ronaldo, for example. But if you don't have a good, healthy pregnancy, you might have had a range up here that's possible, being a great football player. If you don't have that healthy pregnancy, you've diminished that range. That range is still wide, and if you have good experiences along the pathway thereafter, you'll end up there in the range instead of down at the lower end. Foundations for success. So in addition to the factors that are biologically embedded, you've got factors that affect children's development at each stage as they go along. So you might ask, well, how did you choose the particular factors that you chose at each stage of development? So at age 15, and in the new PISA study that we're working on, we've got 5 foundations: quality instruction, learning time, having an inclusive context, material resources, and family involvement. And we know from numerous large-scale studies of school effectiveness that these are really the most important factors. These are the most potent factors. And so we say that they're potent, they have strong effects on outcomes, they're pervasive, they have an effect on a large range of outcomes, and they're also proximal. Proximal in the sense that they have a direct effect on the outcomes. There's nothing, psychologists would use the term mediating. There's nothing mediating the effect of quality instruction on achievement. So you see, principal leadership didn't make it into my foundations. And pre-service teacher education, what many of you are engaged in, also didn't make it into the foundations. Well, having a program on principals leadership doesn't matter unless it translates into quality instruction in the classroom, more learning time for students, more inclusive context, and so on. When I've shown this to some ministers and deputy ministers, often they'll have some pet project that they really are in favor of, and they see, well, gee, that really lies outside of what we're doing. We've got 2 provinces now in Canada that are really grabbing hold of this, and their goal is to take a concept like quality instruction, and they say, here's how it's being measured and defined, here's how our baseline is, and here's where we're going. And so they actually have an owner of the measure, someone who owns the measure, and that person has a committee, and their job is to make sure that the Minister of Education and the ministry staff and the directors of education and the principals and the teachers and even to the students all have a good sense of this is what we mean by quality instruction, and here's where we are now, and here's the goals that we're setting. So I'll just say a little bit more about this transition. Oh, you got an intuition now. When I move my hand, you get it. Thank you. So this transition, critical transition from learning to read, from learning to read to reading to learn. Next slide, please. So in the last 4 years, we've been developing a program called Confident Learners. And it's a program that we've developed with 32 of our First Nations across the country. And we had actually a hard time selling it at first because they were so used to people coming in and trying to sell them the latest reading program. We said, no, we want to develop this program with you. We looked at a lot of different models for reading instruction. There's many different models. and we arrived at this one called the simple view of reading. And it says that reading has two critical complementary components: correlated skills, which is the ability to recognize and understand particular words, and language skills, being able to understand and interpret spoken and written language. Next slide, please. So if you Google on simple view of reading, you'll get a lot of graphs that look like this, where you might have coding skills on the x-axis and language skills on the horizontal axis. And if you measure those skills, say amongst children in grade 3, in a classroom, you might get a distribution that looks like this. Where you'd like to be is in that upper right quadrant. Strong coding skills, strong language skills. You do get some children down in that lower right quadrant who have really good language skills, but poor coding skills. Our oldest daughter was like that going into grade 3. She had phenomenal language skills. She could speak in both English and French. Neither of her parents can speak French, but she didn't know the fundamentals of decoding words, knowing that letters are linked to sounds, and sounds are formed with blends, and you can eventually sound out words until you master them, and then you can recognize them by sight and so on. So we had her tested and found that she was really at a pre-kindergarten level and getting very frustrated. You know, I said about the emotional toll, that was already becoming evident. So we had 100 hours of special tutoring and brought her up to basically grade level. And the woman said to me, "Dr. Willms, she's done remarkable progress. I think she could even be above grade level with another 100 hours. And this was a private agency, so I said, "Here's my Visa card, let's go." And she finished grade 3 with grade 5 reading skills, and that stood her in good stead. Now, those are kids that typically have a very specific type of learning disability, but they need that direct instruction on coding skills. It's so fundamental. Most of the children who fail to learn how to read by the end of grade 3, it's usually a problem with coding skills, more than language. You do have some kids up in that upper left quadrant with good coding skills but poor language. Quite often those are immigrants or children who are smart kids, but they just haven't been exposed to the language. The majority of vulnerable children, and when I talk about 30% of kids in Canada or 60 or 70% of kids in Latin America, they've got both coding issues and language issues. Watch my sleight of hand. Oh, and there'll be kids with intellectual disabilities, learning disabilities, maybe something on the autism spectrum, and so on. Now watch my sleight of hand here. This is the magic. What we did is we mapped out the objectives from kindergarten through to about age 8 or 9 in language skills and put them into 20 different steps, and coding skills and put them in 20 steps. So just focus on a few dots, maybe those 3 dots on the right side. While I do my magic, turn the slide please. They're still there. All I've done is I've moved the axes. So now instead of a child being in deficit, they're just somewhere on the pathway. Maybe they're at step 7 in coding and step 3 in language. And what's the plan? To move them up one step. I don't know if they have this in Ecuador, but it's very popular in Canada. We have a Red Cross swimming program, and children start off during the preschool years. They start off as starfish. It's the very lowest level. And they move on up into being minnows and frogs and eventually whales, and then there are 12 steps to become a lifeguard, basically, or become a very proficient swimmer. The thing is, I could go to anyone on our street and I'd say, "How far did you go in your swimming badges?" "Oh, well, I got to level 7. What did you need to do to go to level 8? "Well, I need to be able to swim 4 lengths of this pool, I'd be able to tread water for 15 minutes. They know exactly what was the next step in the process. And why can't reading be that transparent? Not only that, you could take that child to the swimming pool, and the teacher, also known as the swimming instructor, they would watch that child for 10 minutes. They say, "Ah, child's at about level 7. Let's put him in the level 7 class." Okay? Next slide, please. So we developed a schema for code-related skills that really looks at some of the very basic things, starting from concepts about print, phonological awareness, letter knowledge, and so on. And we mapped them out. And we hired 3 literacy experts from 3 different countries to develop this schema, and we amassed all the curricula from our 10 provinces. There was one from California, one from Texas, one from the UK, one from Australia, and we had a great big wall map, and we mapped out all the skills of coding, mapped out all the skills of language, so we know what the sequence was and how to put those objectives in place. And I sat with them, and they said, oh, that skill, they should know that by the middle of grade 1, or they should know that skill by the end of grade 1. And when we got them all mapped out, this is what it looked like. Whoops, sorry, next slide. We had not very many skills during the kindergarten period, and then all those skills in grade 1. And I said, no, this is not what we're going to do. I said, there's just too many objectives in each step, in those middle steps. When I started thinking about it, though, I call this the reading mountain. So imagine kids coming into your school system, some of them vulnerable for various reasons. We know from work that we're doing in Uruguay that some children enter school more than 1 full year behind their peers, even more in some cases. And so they're entering kindergarten and they go through this thing, and then all of a sudden they hit grade 1 and they got the reading mountain. And they just can't get over the reading mountain. About 30% in our country don't get over it, and I would suggest that about 70% in Latin American countries don't get over it. So what do? In many Latin American countries, we fail the child. We have them repeat grade 1. And then sometimes they get moved on into grade 2, but it's still not working because they haven't got the fundamental skills yet. Next slide, please. So I had great debates. We could call them arguments with my literacy expert. I said, no, you got to push that mountain down and have a consistent set of outcomes, a consistent set of numbers of outcomes at each step along the pathway. So when you look at that set of 20 steps to becoming a proficient reader, you start out with some easy things about concepts about print. Those are the ones in yellow. Getting phonological awareness, knowing the sounds of letters and how they form blends, and so on. Then we also developed a schema for language skills. And the next slide, please. And again, we put it into 20 steps. In those 20 steps, we've got the bottom 2 rows are theme-based. We have 3 themes in each of the steps, so 60 themes. Each theme has about 24 words in it. And there are themes like in the kitchen or outside in the playground and so on. And we work with our indigenous communities to develop what are the important themes, but there are also some themes that are quite universal, like colors and shapes and so on. And we know what the sequence is, so we're developing those language skills. We've also got a set of steps, two of the outcomes in each step are what we affectionately call our AOA words. I don't know how that's going to translate, but it means age of acquisition. And so we have a corpus of 30,000 words, body of words of 30,000 words, and we know how frequently those words are used in children's text. And we also know the age at which children learn particular words. So if you looked at the word vocabulary, for example, that probably has an age of acquisition around 10 or 11. If you looked at something like receptive, maybe it's 11 or 12 or 13. And a word like birthday, even though it's a big word, it has an age of acquisition of 2 years. Because they learn. So anyway, along the pathway there, we've got our AOA words, and we're introduced to about 40 words at each step along the pathway. Next step. So here's the rub, folks. The most challenging thing that all of you as educators have is handling diversity. How are you going to handle diversity when children's coming into the classroom are differing in their levels of skills by about 2 years, right from the get-go? So a kindergarten teacher is dealing with children. They might all be age 4 or 5, but there have some children that have skills of 2 or 3 years old and you've got some other children that have skills of 6 or 7-year-olds. That's the kind of diversity that you have starting in kindergarten. As children make their way through school, that diversity increases. If you go into a grade 3 classroom and you talk to teachers, they'll say, yes, some kids who are down at a grade 1 level, some are up at a grade 5 level. If you go into a grade 9 classroom, they'll say, yes, I've got some children who are at a grade 4 level, and I've also got some children who could handle university material. So adopting this approach requires some shifts in thinking. First, you have to have a skills-based approach, saying, here's where the kids are, here's what they can do, here's what the next step along the process is. So rather than putting energy into saying, oh, this kid's autistic, or this kid has a learning disability, or this kid has some other problem, and not really my problem because I don't deal with those special needs kids, saying, this is what this child can do, here's the next step for them along the pathway. The next shift is having to teach skills along the pathway rather than following a grade-based curriculum. It really struck me, I was at a meeting with the minister in the province of Saskatchewan. It was actually a deputy minister. She was new to the job. And I was ranting and raving about our program in Canada, our teacher training program. And I said, you know, the problem is teachers aren't taught really the fundamentals of teaching how to read. I don't know how to start that. Is it gonna zap me some way? Anyway, I'm gonna keep going. Sorry I'm taking up a bit of your coffee break, but the glitch at the beginning slowed us down a little bit. So you have to teach skills on the pathway rather than following a grade-based curriculum. You can no longer say, I'm a grade 2 teacher, I'm teaching grade 2 skills. That's not going to work. Oh, is that going to stop somehow? So, you have to teach skills on the pathway rather than just saying, I'm a grade 2 teacher. And I would submit to you, if 60 or 70% of your children are not learning to read well in those first 3 years of schooling, if you're a high school teacher, you've got to be a literacy teacher as well. Absolutely. You can't get away without it. And then finally, focusing on measurable objectives, and then on the appropriate learning activities. Most teachers spend their thinking of, what am I going to do tomorrow? So you got to think of what are the objectives, what do you want to accomplish for their kids, then think about the learning activities. We really subscribe to, and this is where Leonard and I might part ways, but not entirely. The research is very clear that teachers who have a very structured approach have much better results. And what do we mean by a structured approach? They set clear and visible goals at the beginning. Today, kids, we're going to learn the days of the week, or whatever it is. You activate prior knowledge. Remember the other day, we talked about this and that. And then, this is the part that many teachers don't do, is modeling the skill. And then you guide the learning. You say, let's try it. And that's where you can have the kinds of activities that Dr. Watt's talking about, engaging activities that's grounded in their culture, and so on. And that's the bulk of the period. Checking for understanding, and then going on to independent practice. So, with our First Nations community, we have this model of learning that says learning is equal to quality instruction times engagement. Oh, sorry, I keep forgetting. One more slide, please. Learning equals quality instruction times engagement times the learning context times the learning time. And so we've developed modules for each of the squares in that. We start off teaching them about the simple view of reading, but we spend a lot of time in that lower left quadrant talking about high-yield teaching strategies. And that's kind of what you have to be about now as prospective teachers, is building the repertoire of what are high-yield teaching strategies. And there's very good research. There's a book by John Hattie called Visible Learning, which really identifies many of those strategies. Next slide, please. Cumulative development. Children develop skills in a cumulative process as they move along the pathway. Next slide, please. Okay, I know we're short of time, but this is the most fun slide. A little bit of math involved for you. Susan Huttenlocher at the University of Chicago, she had mothers bring their babies in, starting at 12 months, and she observed them playing with their children, and she tracked out the number of words that children knew at 12 months, 14 months, 16 months, and so on. And you could basically then connect the dots. And so those are trajectories for about 22 children in her study. You can see that some children there are developing very quickly. They're just taking right off. There's other children that are moving along very slowly. Now they may take off later, you don't know. There's an average trajectory there, that black line, and it has a nice little formula for you. You can take the child's age in months, subtract 12, square and double it. And you'll get about the number of words that a child would typically know. So, for example, a child at 24 months of age, 2 years old, subtract 12, you get 12. Square 144, double it, you get 288. And so if you look at children at 24 months and you go up to the black line and then across to the y-axis, you'll see about 288 words. So, Harvey there, my colleague, Mr. Sanchez, is computing in his head, and I know he has, he used to teach mathematics at the National University, so he figured she should know about 770,000 words by now, but of course he doesn't, because it rises up and levels off. What Susan Huttenlocher did show, though, is that the children who are on very fast trajectories have very talkative mothers. And this work was later repeated by a group, Hart and Risley, and they've done a lot of different studies, and it's not just talkative mothers, of course, it's being exposed to a quantity and quality of language. Children need to hear words 6 or 7 times before those neurons connect to form a synapse. That's really of fundamental importance when you think of children's development of those skills as they move along. I'm going to skip ahead to about 3 slides, please. Next one, there. So we've been measuring those skills in Uruguay. We started with 2 of the districts. This year we've done half of the country, and next year we're going to do the full country. And we're really looking forward to the possibilities of doing a pilot study here in Ecuador. Next slide. We measure those 5 domains that I talked about. Next slide. And we know we can measure those very reliably. We get a very clear fix on children's skills at the beginning. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah. And the last one is selection. I mentioned that the major challenge for teachers is how to handle diversity as kids are making their way through school. And we've developed some very clever strategies to try to manage selection, but they don't work. We have special programs for the gifted. We have baccalaureate programs. We fail kids if they're not measuring up, and so on. Selection is often done horizontally. We call horizontal segregation when kids are segregated according to their socioeconomic background, just by virtue of where parents buy the property, but also then their access to private schooling, or not private schooling, or certain kinds of programs. And then in some school systems, children are also segregated vertically. Germany would be a really prime example where at age 11 they give children quite a formal test, and they say, well, you're destined through university, and they put you in the gymnasium, and you're not, we're going to put you in the Hauptschule, and you're kind of destined to trade programs. And it's very hard to move out of those tracks once they're segregated. We know from PISA data, from looking at data in over 70 countries, that selection, that the more a country is selective, the more they separate rich kids from poor kids, or high-ability kids from low-ability kids. As they're moving along the pathway, the worse their achievement results overall. And that's why one of our key foundations for success is having inclusive classrooms and inclusive schools. With our early years evaluation, we can identify kids that are at risk of not becoming professional, not becoming good readers by the end of grade 3. And actually that's really what we're trying to do with assessment. Rather than using assessment of here's how well you've done up until now, we're saying here's some assessment that says here are the learning needs of these kids going forward. And that's kind of a key idea. So this is a map of a city called Calgary. It's Calgary, Alberta. If any of you have been there. You can see up in the northeast of that city that you've got some schools where more than 50% of the children are vulnerable. And then you've got others in the south part of the city where there's hardly any vulnerable children. That's a form of segregation. I asked Harvey Sanchez this morning, what would be some countries in PISA that you might look to? And he said, well, all of the Latin American countries, but some of our neighbors. Colombia would be one of the neighbors. And you can see there, in this case, I've got the PISA results. The average score for the OECD countries on PISA is 500. And then you can see level 3, level 2, level 1 for the schools in Colombia. But you also see these big divides between the private schools in blue, the urban public schools in green, and the rural schools in red. So I think you'll be excited to see what Ecuador looks like in a year or so from now. So back to our indigenous boy coming home from school on his first day of schooling. I've been called a pathological optimist because I think his chances of completing school is going to be more than 30%. What is it going to take? It takes strong leadership. Got that in the front row here and all the way back, I'm sure right to the back of the room. Dedicated teachers, dedicated to building, designing, engaging programs for children, family and community support, and a relentless focus on building the foundations for success. Thank you very much. So, you're going to have 5 minutes of questions, please. Oh, we got one right there. Oh, I'm going to need my translation.
Buenas tardes. ¿Cuál es la...
Un momentito. I got blasted away. Try again, please.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, thank you.
No problem. ¿Cuáles fueron las principales causas de por qué ese 30% de los niños en Canadá no llegaron a las habilidades requeridas? ¿Y cuáles fueron las causas de por qué ese 70% sí llegó a esas habilidades en Canadá?
Well, there are many causes, and that's what we're trying to do with this educational prosperity model, is identify the key markers of success at each stage of development and the foundations for success. And so, for example, in our indigenous population, we have a number of children who don't have healthy, we're not healthy right at birth. Why? Because of their exposure to toxins, not getting adequate nutrition, mother, and so on. So poverty is a big factor, of course, and you saw the graph with GDP. But I don't want to just say it's all about poverty either, because you can build strong foundations of success all the way along the pathway. So if I went back to that model of showing you what are the foundations at each level, know that at age 2, you need really good quality home environments where kids are getting opportunities for play, opportunities to be exposed to a quality and quantity of language, and so on. So there's multiple causes, but in my view, if we could just tackle 4 or 5 of the real foundations and measure those, all the other things tend to be correlated with those anyway. And so really say, let's just set a singular, relentless focus on those foundations for success, because those are on the causal pathway, if you will. Another question, please? We're good? Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.